Hello. I'm Joe White. I'm the director of the Center for Policy Studies and the Luxembourg Family Professor of Public Policy at Case Western Reserve University. And I'd like to welcome you to this program, a global currents discussion, kindly funded by Ms. Eloise Briskin. And we're very grateful for the support for international affairs programming here at Case Western Reserve University. Today's topic is something that is right out of the headlines, of course, but also in a little more detail than you usually get in the headlines. Clearly, the war in Ukraine is one of the major events of our time. And at one level, part of the story has been the relative unity of the West in response to support of Ukraine, compared to what one might have expected, and the brave and skilled response of the Ukrainians. But another part of the story is the Russian military and its surprising inadequacy relative to the expectations not only of Western observers, but also, I think, of the Russian government itself, and perhaps of the leaders of the Russian military. And clearly, what's going to happen in the future is going to depend as much on the Russian military and its behavior and its success or failures, as it does on the Ukrainians. There's two sides of the same story. And we're reading a lot about the Ukrainians, but it's not so easy to get information about the Russian military. And so as director of the Center for Policy Studies, I thought it'd be nice to do something about this and bring in a speaker about the Russian military, but of course I had no idea who to invite. And so I asked my colleague Kelly McMahon, who is a professor of political science and an expert on Russia and the ex-Soviet Union, among other things, who to invite. And she strongly recommended her friend Dmitry Gorenburg, who she has known for 25 years and sees as a sort of turn-to person on these kinds of questions, or go-to person. And so first of all, thank you very much, Kelly. And before I go on to further introduction of Dr. Gorenburg, I think also Professor McMahon has an announcement to make.
Sure.
You should.
So the live stream.
Yeah, please come over here so the people on the live stream can hear.
Okay. Hi. So on behalf of the student organization Project Ukraine, this is a Case Western Reserve University student organization, I wanted to let you know about their fundraiser in support of a Ukrainian orphanage, which is stocking up on winter coats and other warm clothing for winter. So these are Ukrainian children who were evacuated to Poland. So they're in an orphanage in Poland. And Project Ukraine, the student organization, has set up to ship them winter clothing. And there's the opportunity to donate through Amazon, just scanning a QR code. It's very easy. So I'm just going to pass a couple flyers with the QR code at the end of each row. So if you're interested, or if you know someone who's interested, take a flyer home, please. Thank you. And can we? I don't know how to do this for the live stream.
Is there a way that they could go to this Facebook post?
That won't work.
Okay.
Anyway, we'll figure that out later. Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
If you are watching the live stream and you want information about how to donate to this project, please email me, joseph.white@case.edu, and I will have the information and I will share it with you. Okay. So I want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Gorenburg. He is an expert on security issues in the former Soviet Union, Russian military reform, Russian foreign policy, and ethnic politics and identity. Apparently that matters in everybody's politics. Maybe Japanese. His recent research topics include decision-making processes, and this was before the war, decision-making processes in the senior Russian leadership, Russian naval strategy in the Pacific and the Black Sea, and Russian maritime defense doctrine. He is the author of a book on minority ethnic mobilization in the Russian Federation, published with Cambridge University Press, and of many, many journal articles published in places like World Politics and Post-Soviet Affairs. He is also a leader in the community of scholars of Russia and the ex-Soviet Union. He is currently editor of the journal Problems of Post-Communism, and he edited the journal Russian Politics and Law for many years. He also previously served as executive director of the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. Having emigrated to the United States at the age of 8, I believe, from St. Petersburg, as it was not known then. He received a BA in International Relations from Princeton University and a Ph.D. in Political Science from Harvard University. He blogs on issues related to the Russian military at the blog Russian Military Reform. He is, of course, a native Russian speaker. And as I said, a major scholar on the question of the Russian military, who I'm extremely pleased to welcome and to listen to. For those in the audience, we will have a question session, and I think we can just do it by having people just walk up to the microphone and posing their questions. But first, let's hear from Dr. Gorenburg. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming out. This is a great honor to be here. Thanks to Joe and Kelly for inviting me. So I'm going to try to walk through the events of the last 8 months now in the war, and also try to put them in some context of what assign some meaning to the some of the reasons for the way things developed the way they did for the Russian military. Now, when the war, before the war began, or over the past decade, the Russian Federation was working on radically increasing its military power. So in 2008, Russia had struggled to handle a relatively brief local war with neighboring Georgia. It went pretty well for Russia, but they saw a lot of problems and realized that if they had to try to fight a more powerful adversary, it would have been problematic in terms of communications, coordination between services. Things like friendly fire incidents were an issue. Communications, secure channels and things like that were a problem. So there were a whole host of issues that they resolved to deal with, and they started a reform process at that time that then continued for several years. And so less than 10 years later, Russia had achieved the ability to launch a regional war while simultaneously maintaining an air campaign in Syria, naval power projection in the Mediterranean Sea, and a low-intensity kind of war by proxy in eastern Ukraine. So I'm talking about, after 2015, Russia had started this operation in Syria, was still fighting in Ukraine, and it had enough forces to do other things as well. So as its military might grew, Russia's foreign policy also became more and more assertive, ranging from threats and intimidation via cyber attacks and nerve agent attacks on opposition leaders, to covert and overt military interventions in various places around the world. And this assertiveness culminated in February's invasion of Ukraine. So that's kind of just by way of introduction, because what happened afterwards was a bit surprising. Obviously, it's clear that obviously Russia's initial invasion went poorly, and things have really not improved much for the Russian military in the subsequent 8 months. Now, the war's looks like it's going to continue for the foreseeable future, and I'll talk a bit at the end about potential scenarios. But so it's really because the war is continuing, and therefore not only do we not know how things will develop over the longer term, but there's also a lot of information that's still about what's happened in the last 8 months that's not available. So it's a bit too early to provide kind of an overall assessment of Russia's military performance. But it's not too late to start making some preliminary assessments of some of these initial phases. And then so I'm going to do that. I'm going to divide the war into 3 phases, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And I'm going to discuss some of the things that went wrong for the Russian military, and what Russia has done over time to try to adjust its strategy to take into account the failures that it was seeing. So let me make sure that, yeah, okay. So this is kind of the phase 1. Why did Russia start this war? It's very briefly, because I can give a much longer foreign policy talk on this, but there are 2 main reasons. One was, so Russia wanted to have a firm say over Ukraine's foreign policy and internal governance. There's a lot of discussion that I think we can bracket for now of whether this is imperialism or, some kind of neo-colonialism, or just wanting to have some kind of dominance. The second reason is to block further NATO expansion and end Ukrainian defense cooperation with NATO members. Now, based on its past experience with the Minsk Accords that ended the most active phase of the 2014-2015 war, Russian leadership had decided that Ukrainian promises couldn't be trusted. They believed that Ukraine was refusing to carry out the promises it had made in Minsk, and therefore they wanted to install a government in Kyiv that is less hostile to Russia, either ideally pro-Russian or at the least neutral, right? That was the initial goal. Now, if that proved too difficult, partition was, I think, an alternative possibility from the start, with a pro-Russian government in eastern and southern Ukraine, and ideally in controlling Kyiv as well, and then with Western Ukraine could be left to NATO or Poland or whoever else wanted to take care of it from the Russian point of view. So that's kind of the basic foreign policy outlook. But then the question arises: why now? Why 2022? So I think and this is maybe a little bit more speculative because I think it's hard to know, what's going on in Vladimir Putin's head and in his entourage. But I think, one factor that may play a role is COVID and Putin's isolation. So pre-COVID, Putin, although he had a fairly small circle of intimates, he did talk to people who had a variety of outlooks within the Russian elite, including people who focused on economic matters, for example, and therefore were maybe more concerned about the consequences of more adventurous foreign policy actions. He really isolated himself to a huge extent during COVID. So he only talked in person to a couple of people. I mean, there were Zoom sessions and things like that, but in terms of having discussions, I think he was more his circle had shrunk to people who were mostly in this kind of security sphere and maybe more of the kind of paranoid, the West is out to destroy our regime kind of persuasion. So that's one reason. The second one is perceptions of Western weakness, and there were a few factors here. One was the withdrawal from Afghanistan by the United States, and that had clearly gone very poorly and was interpreted in Moscow as a sign of U.S. weakness, and that the U.S. was no longer willing to kind of maintain these foreign commitments and engagements, and therefore might not support Ukraine very strongly. Russian leadership perceptions of Joe Biden, I think they really, there's been a lot of Russian propaganda about how he's old and senile, but I think that it's not just propaganda. They actually believe that. And so they thought of him as an ineffective leader who could not accomplish much in terms of galvanizing opposition to Russian invasion. And finally, the departure of Angela Merkel is because she was the one European leader that I think Putin really did respect in a kind of that as someone who had gravitas, he did. There were other reasons he didn't respect her, but in terms of like her ability to galvanize the EU and her departure and replacement particularly by a social democrat, given the history of Russian kind of perceptions that they had maybe bought the Social Democrat Party, and given Gerhard Schroeder's career post being prime chancellor, that I think that Merkel's departure was another factor that influenced the foreign policy. Could somebody get me a cup of water? Thank you. So let's turn more directly to the military side now. That was kind of by way of preview. So what forces did Russia have in place for this fight? Approximately 100 or so battalion tactical groups. And battalion tactical group was a kind of a fighting unit, officially about 800 personnel. In reality, as we found out later, some were not fully staffed. It was maybe more like 600, but in any case, thank you. And I think this is your folder. You should be able to put it over. Yeah, this is your folder, I think. Yeah, okay. So that's kind of for fighting forces, plus support elements. So more than half of Russia's total available BTGs were moved to near the Ukrainian border, and the map kind of shows where some of the main armies were located. So this means about 80 to 100,000 combat troops. If you add in the support elements, the various separatist, Donbass militias, probably closer to 150,000, plus additional aerospace and naval units as well. There was speaking of naval units, there was a significant naval force in the Black Sea and the Med. This just shows the Med part, but there was, if you, hopefully, yeah, you could, there's, you can see some of the names of the ships or types of the ships up there. But the Turkish closure of the Bosphorus meant that additional ships from other fleets could no longer be brought into the Black Sea. It was essentially, closed to ships that were not based in the Black Sea to start with. So that's kind of where things, what the forces were like at the beginning. This is kind of the war plan at the start of the plan. This is a couple of different leaks, I guess. The build, and then had a leak, and then the published maps of potential invasion plans. And CSI also put together potential invasion plans, and so those are on this map. So what we can see is, first of all, a lightning strike on Kiev from the north and from Russia through Belarus and from Russian territory as well, and an airborne attack on Hostomel Airport that's right near Kiev, and that would kind of be the base through which they could then pump more troops into Kiev fairly quickly. And there was an expectation that the Ukrainian leadership would flee or surrender at that point. So that was kind of a big part of that plan in the north. Then you have takeover in the south, moving out of Crimea, taking the key cities Kherson and Mykolaiv, which is kind of halfway between Kherson and Odessa, not on this map. And then press on to Odessa, likely including an amphibious landing as well. Now, this part of the plan didn't work fully, but it worked better than any other part of the plan. And then the third part was to surround the main Ukrainian military force in the Donbass that had been fighting there for 8 years by moving simultaneously from the north and the east. Because basically the, let's see, I'm not sure if there's a pointer aspect to this here. Maybe not. Yes. Okay, so basically this line here was very strongly fortified, and so very hard to attack directly through there. But if you come in here and here, you could surround these forces and then combine with an attack here, wipe them out. And the idea was that they would, in all these areas, they would bypass the main cities if there was any resistance, and then come back and get them afterwards. In some cases, like in Kherson, there wasn't actually much resistance, so they just took it. But in other places, especially in the north, like in Sumy, which was on this dot along that line of advance here, they just kind of bypassed it for the time being. Now, how did this line up with analysts' expectations before the war? We expected a longer period of kind of air and missile strikes before there was a ground invasion, to diminish resistance, to establish air superiority by wiping out Ukrainian air defenses and the Ukrainian Air Force, and then after that, say a week or so of that, then start the main fight. First in the east and the south, and then press on to Kiev after successes there. So we thought something more sequential rather than kind of try to take over the whole country. So what actually happened? And this is, hopefully this works, yes. Okay, so this is just going to keep scrolling through the first phase of the invasion. And the pink parts are where the Russian troops control. And so there were initial pretty rapid, as you can see, territorial gains on all fronts, but not as much as they expected. In particular, they got bogged down near Kiev. And part of the problem, and you can see in the, like you can see this now with the little pink lines just along roads, there were these kind of thunder runs where Russian troops, armored columns would just kind of go forward, outrunning their supply columns, and they'd get in trouble as a result. So they'd basically be, they'd get too far, they'd run out of ammunition, they'd run out of food, it might get ambushed. You have this problem if you have a tank column and it's not dispersed, and you can take out the first tank and the last tank, and then everybody's trapped, right? So there were initially, as you can see, there were pretty rapid advances in the south, but they were stopped near Mykolaiv, short of Mykolaiv, and as a result, they couldn't advance on Odessa as they planned, or go farther north. The other issue, there was this long, as you may remember from the news from last spring, there was a fairly lengthy resistance in Mariupol that pinned down a large number of Russian troops, so they couldn't move north against the Ukrainian military in the Donbass. So that's kind of just a description of what happened. But what were the Russian mistakes? First of all, they misjudged the Ukrainians. They expected a lot less resistance. They believed their own propaganda about Ukrainians treating them as liberators, at least in the east and the south. Second, they didn't prepare their own troops well enough. Many troops had not been told that they would actually be invading Ukraine. So some of the soldiers that were captured early on said that they had been told they were just participating in a military exercise. Others that they were being sent just to the eastern Donbass region. So that meant that they were psychologically unprepared to actually get involved in real warfare and take casualties. So that took an immediate toll on troops' morale. Right? So early on, like I think in this first phase, there were probably, I mean, it's hard to know for sure, but probably 15 to 20,000 Russian soldiers were killed, plus additional tens of thousands wounded. And that meant that a lot of units were quickly put out of commission and unable to fight, because even if the loss in a unit is only 20%, that doesn't mean that, oh, now we just do do 80% of the work, but it means that there are certain tasks that maybe there's no one to do, right? Because some people have specialized training, especially in the more advanced units. So that makes it very difficult to continue fighting. Third issue, insufficient logistics. The military planners expected the war to last 2 weeks, and they didn't stock enough supplies near the front lines for a longer fight. And they didn't have, again, because they expect the war not to last very long, they didn't have plans to resupply. And then when they did start trying to resupply, some of the trains were getting attacked and destroyed. They also lacked certain kinds of equipment, such as thermal imaging for night vision. And they started running out already early on, started running out of precision weapons. And so they certainly by the end of March, they were kind of resorting to indiscriminate shelling. Fourth issue, they failed to take out Ukraine's air defenses. I already mentioned the lack of the extended bombing campaign prior to the start of the invasion. And that meant that Ukraine's air defense systems and air forces continue to operate. And Russian ground operations took place without sufficient air support because, again, they couldn't necessarily get the planes in place. Another issue is, and this one's one that's still puzzling to me, and I have some colleagues who are working on reports explaining this, is the Russian Air Force's failure to do complex operations. So we kind of expected, based on the Syria campaign, that the Air Force could operate pretty well. But there were really very few examples of the Russian Air Force operating more than one or two planes at a time. So the squadron operations that really are required for complex air operations seem to be missing. And so not clear why. I'm hoping that we'll get answers in due time. A few more, because there's a lot of us. Attacking on too many fronts. They neglected to consider, or insufficiently considered, the size of the country they were attacking, right? So they didn't have, the force ratio was estimated to be about 4 to 1, and that was vastly insufficient. They probably need, like, to conquer that much territory, probably needed something like a 20 ratio, according to people who study such things. So they tried to attack on 4 fronts simultaneously, from the north toward Kiev, northeast toward Kharkiv, east from the Donbass, and then from the south out of Crimea toward Kherson and Mykolaiv. And there were troops from multiple districts. There was no overall commander for the operation. And they also didn't really prioritize the different operations. They were kind of trying to do everything at once. Using unsecured communications. A lot of their secured communication systems failed. And so they started using old-fashioned radios and cell phones. Ukrainians were then able to intercept these communications and create ambushes in some cases. And that also allowed them to target commanders. And not just, there was a lot of media attention to generals who were killed. And that's certainly significant, but also a disproportionate number early on of mid-level commanders, kind of majors and colonels that were killed. And that also creates then obvious command chain issues, right? And disorganizes the opposing military. Especially given that Russia still had an excessively centralized command structure. Now, Russia's highly centralized military does not really empower troops on the ground to make decisions or issue orders. So the way the U.S. military, for example, works is by, they give a commander a mission and say, go do this, go take this hill, or go take out that unit over there. And it's up to that commander to decide how best to do that, right? Whereas the Russian model is, we need to do that thing. We're going to figure out at headquarters how to do it, and then we're going to tell the commanders on the ground how to do what they need to do. The problem with that method is if when something doesn't work out, when the enemy doesn't react the way you expect them to react, that commander isn't trained to take initiative and make adjustments. And, you know, I mean, they may try, but they may not be so good at it, or they may just call back to headquarters and say, what do we do now, right? In which case, you know, so troops end up running into difficulties, and they can't really shift gears to adjust to their new circumstances, and so that slows things down. We thought that this is one of the analysts prior to the invasion really thought that they had solved this problem in training, because this was a known problem, and that they had, you know, they talked a lot about changing the culture, but clearly they had not, because we saw this happening again. And finally, they failed to have a plan B. They weren't prepared for the level of resistance, and they had no backup plan for what to do if the plans went awry. So instead, the troops just kept pressing ahead as originally ordered, driving into ambushes, and then steadily getting killed by the Ukrainian forces. So armored convoys were getting dispatched without sufficient infantry support, and that made them easy targets for Ukrainians armed with portable anti-tank weapons such as javelins, which they had early on. So that's kind of how the initial invasion went awry. And a lot of the subsequent problems kind of derive from that, because once you've lost a lot of the more capable units, which they did in early March, you don't have them anymore, and you just have to make do with what you have. So, phase 2, they revised the war plan. This is starting late March, early April. They withdrew completely from the north, where supply lines were most strained and where they were facing the strongest counterattacks. They dug in the south, where they'd made the most gains. They tried to hold what they'd gained. Now, many analysts at the time, already this was April, thought that they were eventually going to have to withdraw from the city of Kherson because it was on the wrong side of the Dnieper River. Let's see if there's a good map. Yeah. So, you know, here's this is this salient here. You can see it's the big old river here. So it's harder to maintain that if you have to get across the river. But we'll get to that in phase 3. So plan B was to conquer the Donbass, which would give Putin an achievement that he could then claim as a victory. So the goal, again, I think was this goal doesn't change that much from the first version, just kind of narrows to just the one goal rather than 4. Encircle Ukraine's main army in the region, primarily moving from the north and south. So you can see that here. At this point, they were down to about 76 BTGs. Some were down some because of losses. Others there were, you know, in the south, in Kherson and places like that. And they'd taken Izium, which you can see on the map. And the next major targets were Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, directly south of there. Now, one key point was that they still were not taken Mariupol here. And they wanted to quickly subdue that city in order to free up forces that they could then move north from the south to complete that encirclement. But they found it, and they were, of course, it was still the difficulties in advancing from the east, because that's where the Ukrainian forces were dug in. But they could use mass artillery strikes to hold the Ukrainian military in place, while the other forces kind of created a pincer movement and surrounded them. The idea was that if they take all of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, that would match the originally announced war aims, because they never announced that they were going to take over all Ukraine. They announced that they were going to take Donetsk and Luhansk and defend them. Slavyansk was seen as the key battle. It seemed clear to analysts, at least, that if they couldn't take it within a few weeks of the start of this phase, then the plan would fail. And as it turned out, they couldn't do it. They shrank the aims again to focus on capturing the remaining unoccupied parts of Luhansk region, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which is basically this little section here. You can see that this is Luhansk, the boundary of Luhansk Oblast right there. So, as you can see, they did advance here, but it was fairly slow going. And between April and July, they used massed artillery to destroy adversary units or force them to retreat, and in doing so, they made progress, but slow progress. They had this advantage because they had more powerful artillery, but they were short on infantry, so they couldn't really turn that advantage into significant territorial gains. And they kept postponing the deadlines to take Severodonetsk because the advances were so slow. Both sides were taking high casualties. They were exacerbating the manpower crisis, especially for Russia, because Russia was still at that time, trying to pursue this as a limited operation. Meanwhile, Ukraine launched, and here we have phase 2. Ukraine launched its first counteroffensive. This was near Kharkiv, and they were able to push Russia outside the range of artillery firing range of the city. In some cases, they even went as far as reaching the Russian border, and this was back in July or so. And it also began slowly regaining territory in the south, and you can see that with some of the blue lines on the map. But in the summer, they still didn't have the manpower or the weapons advantage to make a huge breakthrough at that point. So they were really focused on retaking occupied territory on the right bank of the Dnieper, again, near Kherson. And they were slowly advancing with infantry clearing territory, but really no more than 1 or 2 kilometers a day. So this was kind of where things were in phase 2. This was kind of the stalemate period of the war, April to July. And then phase 3, which began, which we can call the Ukrainian counteroffensive phase, right? That began in earnest in late August as longer-range Western weapons, particularly HIMARS systems, longer-range artillery, allowed Ukrainian forces to target Russian ammunition and fuel supply centers. And so that, in addition to affecting the availability of ammunition and fuel directly because they were blown up, it also strained Russian logistics by making resupply more difficult. They had to now transport supplies longer distances, and often by road rather than rail, and Russian logistics is really rail-based, so they have a limited number of trucks, and if they have to now go longer distances, they don't have as many of them to use, and so things get, their supply shortages become more of an issue. The other problem for them was that troops on the right bank of the Dnieper became largely cut off from large-scale resupply because the bridges, there were only a couple of bridges over the Dnieper there, and they were either destroyed or damaged, and so you couldn't get big trucks across them and things like that. And so they had to start using pontoons and ferries, which would also come under attack. And they also realized that they would most likely have to abandon most of their heavy equipment if they were to withdraw from the right bank, because they couldn't get it back. They couldn't get it back without the bridges. There was also, of course, the long-range strikes also had a morale boosting component for the Ukrainian side, especially when they were striking symbolic targets like the Black Sea Fleet headquarters, for example. At the same time, there were also, beyond the purely military side, there were also more kind of subversive activity and political actions, such as assassinating, Ukrainian guerrilla fighters were assassinating leading collaborators in some of the cities in regions that were occupied, and that made the occupied territory harder to control. So let me move on to, here we go. So the combination of damage to Russia's supply lines and the manpower shortage the Russian military was facing allowed Ukraine to break through Russian lines in September in several regions. So it seems like, if you follow the media, it seemed like the Ukrainian counteroffensive started in September when they took this territory back in Kharkiv. But really the preparations for that were made in August. They were kind of softening up the Russian forces in a way in order to then launch this surprise attack in Kharkiv. Now, the element of surprise is very important here. The Ukrainians, for about a month or two at that point, had been promoting the likelihood of an offensive in Kherson. And Russia had, as a result, transferred some of its best remaining troops to that region to defend it. Right? Kharkiv had been left pretty lightly defended with pretty low-quality troops. There was almost no second line, so if there was a breakthrough, they could just keep going, the Ukrainian side. And this was because they didn't really expect an attack there. And so this surprise attack led to a rout and rapid Russian retreat that liberated most of the occupied parts of the region in about 10 days, as you can see on the map. You can see the advances there. Russian troops essentially pulled back to the Russian border in the northern part of the region, and then in the east to the Donetsk River, which was a better defensive line than anything else they had. So that's not quite on the border of the region, but not far away. So now we go to the phase 3 map. This was sort of the second part of, now we're into October, and there were concurrent offensives in both the east and the south. So Luhansk in the east and Kherson in the south. In Luhansk, they went around that river defensive line and liberated Liman and Yampil, and that put the supply lines for Severodonetsk under threat, which, if you remember, Russia had taken Severodonetsk just in July after several months. In Kherson, they liberated the northernmost part of the right bank, and that increased the threat of forces in Kherson city being entirely cut off from retreat. And this kind of shows you maybe a little bit more clearly how much territory has been liberated. That's the kind of the light blue in the last couple months. So they're making further advances in both the east and the south. Just earlier this week, there's a key resupply road in the east that was largely cut off, and that's, let's see, right there. You can see, and they're kind of going. They're trying to get to this line. This is the railroad line, and if they can cut that off, then that would be even more significant. We saw reports earlier this week that Russian occupation authorities were abandoning the city of Kherson, while at the same time the military seemed to be digging in and preparing for urban warfare. I'm not so sure that Ukrainian side is particularly interested in urban warfare. They may just surround them and wait it out. I'm not sure how that'll work. So that's kind of where things are. Let me do a few minutes of just on kind of the impact of the recent developments on the situation. So, what's the effect of Western weapons? Replenishing scarce supplies, though captured Russian weapons and ammunition is maybe even more significant just in terms of sheer numbers, especially Russian ammo, because you can use that in the weapons Ukrainians already have domestically that they don't necessarily, that Western ammunition doesn't really work for. The Western weapons' longer ranges mean more Russian targets are vulnerable. That complicates the supply lines, brings the war home to border regions in Russia, such as Belgorod. Then there's the symbolic acts. The sinking of the Moskva increases morale. These are the Ukrainian stamps that they published in response. But also there was a military component. The sinking of the Moskva made the Black Sea Fleet move farther away. It eliminated the threat of that amphibious landing. And it maybe made the blockade marginally harder to enforce, so that wasn't particularly significant. Russia losing Snake Island meant an additional loss of air defense sensors, so again, more problems for the Black Sea Fleet. And so the Russian Navy is now pretty much limited to long-range strikes with cruise missiles and then the blockade enforcement. The symbolism of the Kerch Bridge, I think, is fairly obvious, given that it's a symbol of the annexation of Crimea. It was built after Crimea was annexed. The bridge is not completely out of commission. The damage that was done does complicate Russian logistics, at least for the foreseeable, next month, however long it takes to repair it, a couple months probably. There's only one of on the road, only one lane was open. Plus, they were increased security checks. That meant there were traffic jams. So if you have a lot of traffic jams on a road, you can't really bring supply trucks through so well. The half of the rail capacity was initially knocked out, so only one track was usable. I haven't really tracked whether that second track has been repaired or not, but in any case, given the importance of that rail, that's very significant. Now, so that's another issue that I think is important is limits on Russian long-range weapons. Ostensibly in response to the Kerch Bridge attack, the Russian military switched tactics and they began to target civilian infrastructure, primarily electricity generation, with long-range strikes again. I suspect that change in targeting civilian infrastructure was actually a response to the territorial losses and was already being planned before the Kerch Bridge attack, and that was just kind of a good excuse for them to launch it. Part of the problem for the Russians is that Ukrainian air defenses, which are still available, are in some cases being strengthened with Western European systems that reduce the effectiveness of some of these strikes. So about 50% of the missiles are being shot down, plus probably 3/4 or so of the drones. So that they need to use more weapons to have the effect that they want to have. And they don't have the missiles to sustain this level of attack for long, as you can see. I mean, this is an estimate, we don't actually know, but not sure what's happening. But so this is why they're starting to buy Iranian missiles and drones, right? Which are certainly a threat to Ukrainian infrastructure. Even though I don't think they're really going to have any effect on the battlefield, right? There's two things going on now. There's the sort of the strikes on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, and then there's still the battle. So I think as long as the war continues, there's going to be more long-range strikes on major cities away from the front line. And it's a way for the Russian leadership to highlight the insecurity of all Ukrainians in order to undermine support for continuing the war. Now, the historical record shows that these kinds of campaigns are usually kind of a last resort and are ineffective. And there was a very good article on this in Foreign Affairs quite recently, sort of looking at that historical record. Another issue is this question of mobilization. It was announced on September 21st in Russia, partial mobilization of 300,000, plus perhaps more significantly what they call stop loss. That is, troops that are people who are already in the force in fighting in Ukraine can no longer just tear up their contracts and resign. They have to stay as long as the war is continuing. The political aspects of this are actually, I think, fairly limited. There were fairly limited protests. There were a large number, several 100,000 Russians left in the last month. That's clearly significant, but not really necessarily significant in terms of the actual mobilization, because the people who were leaving were not necessarily the people who were going to get mobilized. There were mobilizations occurring disproportionately in rural, poorer regions. The people who have the wherewithal to just leave are more likely to be wealthy and from bigger cities and so forth. So mobilization is unlikely to be a game changer, but it may help to slow or stop Ukrainian advances. So the way the mobilized forces are being used is kind of two parts. Some are being kind of sent to the line right away just to kind of fill gaps. And the thing about those people, with very limited training, they may not be so useful in terms of war fighting, But if they're just bodies in a trench somewhere or behind a fortification, then if the Ukrainians are advancing, they still have to deal with them. Even if they're surrendering, they still have to deal with them, right? They have to like process them, and this slows down the advance. So that kind of that aspect is important. So they're kind of. Then the second part is I think some troops are being actually held in reserve for more training, with the possibility of forming new units later on, and possibly launching a counteroffensive in the spring or something like that. But mobilization, so it's effective for shoring up lines, less effective for prosecuting new advances, at least in the short term when you need more skilled fighters. There's still the problem of low morale due to the various supply and training problems, and that's going to impact fighting ability as well. So what's Russia's current strategy? They're trying to signal that they're in it for the long haul and they won't back down. That was the annexation move, right? We've annexed this territory. It's ours. You can't have it, and so on. They're making it painful for Ukraine by targeting infrastructure. They're continuing to fight. They're trying to make it painful for Europe to continue to support Ukraine with the energy weapon, right? Trying to make European publics kind of try to stop the war, basically, because of the costs of the energy, and then make the publics in the West, both Europe and the U.S., afraid with all this talk of nuclear threats, right? And they're also, on the side, they're trying to encourage political divisions in both the U.S. and Europe. So, trying to play up with the isolationists. We saw this today even with the speech in Valdai, where Putin was trying to play up, some of the benefits of his policies for conservative forces in the West. There's also the kind of peace at any cost progressives that they're trying to work with. We're seeing some of these divisions in Italy, where some of the parties are potentially going to be in the new government are relatively pro-Russia, although not the main one. So they hope that these factors together can push the West and Ukraine, but really the West, because they really believe that Ukraine is a puppet, right, of the West, push them to the negotiating table where they can lock in some of these gains that they've made, and then they can use that breather to potentially rebuild for potential future rounds of this conflict. So. And I'm coming to the end here. So what's the future look like? In the short term, I think in terms of the ground effort, I expect to see one more big push, like in the next 2 to 3 weeks, before the weather conditions worsen. It could be in Kherson. It could be in northern Luhansk. It could be in both. They've shown they can work do both at the same time. Some possibility of a new direction in the south in Zaporizhia, but I think it's less likely because it's easier to try to break through in areas where Russian forces are less dug in because they've retreated recently than in places where the lines have been stable for months. Then there's going to be a temporary pause for maneuver warfare as the weather deteriorates. But not, a lot of times they say, oh, for the winter. I don't think it's going to be for the winter. I think it's going to be for a couple of months while the roads are bad and everything is muddy. But then we might see more fighting again once the ground freezes. At least in the northeast, in the east, maybe in the south, there may be less freezing. But and especially if it seems like the Russian forces are having supply problems with cold weather gear, for example. If the Ukrainians feel that they're more comfortable fighting in the cold than the Russian forces, then they could try to take advantage of that. Now, at the same time, Russia is going to continue its efforts to degrade Ukrainian power infrastructure in a kind of, and I think will be a futile effort to reduce Ukrainian resolve and bring them to the negotiating table. And Russia's also likely to take further steps to undermine European resolve to support Ukraine, both through additional efforts to destabilize the energy supply to Europe and through efforts to promote pro-Russian political forces in the EU countries, such as Italy and Bulgaria. And then in the medium term, I expect the Russian military to form new units out of some of these newly mobilized soldiers with the goal of providing them sufficient training to attempt a counteroffensive in the spring. And then subsequent developments will depend on the success of these strategies. So the extent of continued Western support, the extent to which Ukraine feels it can continue to make further territorial gains on the battlefield. And so that relates directly to the key factors shaping the conflict, the balance of forces on the battlefield, and the extent of Western resolve in continuing to fund and equip Ukraine. Now, for the second, the results of the U.S. midterm elections and subsequent Republican Party positions may affect the perceived durability of U.S. support, which is going to be very critical if the fight lasts into the longer term, i.e. beyond 2023. So that, I think, was a political conversation that's going to play out over the next few months in Congress and elsewhere. And then the third factor is the extent to which the Russian public and political elites continue to be supportive of Russia's war effort, or at least apathetic for the public. I believe that the chances of domestic pressure forcing policy change are pretty low, but they're not zero. So that kind of leads me to my last point. This is entirely speculative future scenarios, right? So these are five scenarios kind of in decreasing order of likelihood that I kind of made up. So we'll see. So one, Ukraine continues to make territorial gains, albeit at a slower pace than it was doing in September. So Western resolve remains unshaken, and financial aid continues to flow. Russia, of course, refuses to admit defeat, and the war continues in largely the same manner as it has been in recent weeks. That's one. Two, Russian mobilization sufficiently alleviates the manpower shortage to prevent Ukraine from making further territorial gains over the next year or so. The war settles into kind of a more static attritional conflict, and pressure builds in the West to formalize a ceasefire along the existing lines of control. Because, right now, Ukraine is obviously not interested in the ceasefire because they think they can make more gains. But if it really feels like the front isn't moving, maybe there'd be more opportunities for that. Third option is additional Russian defeats increase pressure on Putin, leading to escalation. And I don't think it's nuclear, although that can't be 100% ruled out, but I think nuclear is mostly talk to scare the West rather than actual desire to use nuclear weapons. But, this radiological thing is a possibility, dirty bomb or whatever, it's maybe a possibility. But this only leads to greater Western resolve and more discomfort among key neutral parties, such as China and India. And then there's more pressure on Russia to end the war, and then it becomes even more unclear whether Russia doubles down or backs off or what happens. A successful Russian counteroffensive is not out of the question. And that could lead to some territorial gains for Russia in the spring. And then that could lead to, again, pressure for a ceasefire, maybe a stalemate after a certain point. See how that plays out. But probably more pressure for a ceasefire is most likely. And then finally, deterioration of Western support for Ukraine leads to pressure to enter into negotiations without any of the other things happening. So I hope that was enlightening. I'm happy to take questions. We probably have, 30 minutes or so. All right, I guess microphone. You need to speak into the microphone or else nobody will hear you.
The microphone here, is it on? No, I'm going to turn it on. Okay, you need to speak into the microphone here. We'll start with Professor Paris.
Should I stand over here?
Well,
Thank you for this. This is really very interesting. I have two questions, if I'm allowed to ask two, right?
Sure.
So considering where Russia is from a military standpoint, like kind of weak, unplanned, and then where the West is in terms of not wanting to commit too much, is there a game changer in terms of Western military aid that would tip the scale towards the Ukrainians, seeing that Russia is weaker militarily? And then my second question is, does the stalemate, the longer war, play into what Putin wants anyways? Weaken the Western resolve, and even if it's not going well, it's not like the West is like 200% committed, and that a failing Russian initiative is not necessarily a bad thing for Putin past, say, into the winter especially, but, into 2023.
Yeah, so I think, the one thing that I think would materially help Ukrainian offensive possibilities is longer range missiles, right? Like in the same way that that having HIMARS allowed them to target logistics hubs farther away from the immediate front line. If you get an even longer range weapon, you can extend that, right? So that creates even more complications for supplies, which then creates all those problems for the front line. So I think that's more than, some of the other things that, I mean, from a battlefield perspective, right? From the point of view of if you're trying to protect your energy infrastructure, right, and domestic, civilian populations in the cities under attack, more air defenses obviously would help. I mean, they're already reasonably good, but even better ones, whether it's Iron Dome or whatever. I'm not particularly an expert on air defense technology, so I don't know what's better or worse. But that's the kind of thing that would help. In terms of your second question, I think that's kind of what I was implying by saying that they would increase, a ceasefire would, a stalemate would increase pressure towards a ceasefire. I think that pressure would come from the peace at any cost lobby, let's say, would have more would get more play if it seemed like progress wasn't being made, right? And the Ukrainians knew this. This is why they felt that in August, September, that it was so important to launch a counteroffensive that showed visible success, because they knew that kind of interest was fading in the West, right? In the media and so forth. And so they needed to show some sign of progress in exchange for all the weapons and aid that they've been given, right?
So please raise your hand if you think you would have a question. While I'm walking this over, I'm going to ask one. So Ukraine is the Ukraine population is about 30% the size of the Russian population. And so we think of Russia as a much bigger country. But first of all, Ukraine is a pretty big country, even with the people who've run away from it. And secondly, Russia is not going to mobilize anywhere near as much as Ukraine is from the looks of things. And so I guess my question is, how great is the potential troop imbalance between the two militaries?
I think that, what we saw in most of the war so far was that there was Russia had a manpower shortage and Ukraine had a technology shortage, right? Relatively speaking, right? And that was the Ukrainians, through Western assistance and also capturing some Russian equipment, were equalizing the technology shortage side of that equation. And the Russians, through mobilization, are now trying to equalize the manpower side of that equation. And I think that I don't have a good sense of the numbers of the Ukrainian military fighting right now. It's in part because I don't track it as closely, and in part because they're not super vocal about those things. But they are taking casualties, right? This is not like we talk about Russian casualties because we're on one side. We are on one side of this conflict, and there are certainly incentives to publicize Russian casualties and not so much to publicize Ukrainian casualties, right? So I think that they can, I don't know if they can fully equalize the manpower, but they can get it much closer. The question is, it's one thing to have bodies, it's another thing to have trained bodies, right, and equipped bodies, and people that actually want to fight, right? If you're kind of forcibly mobilized, maybe you're not that motivated to do much. So I think that's going to be where the gap remains.
questions. Russia apparently has 4,000 airplanes. Huge air force, apparently. So they, in theory, could just bomb Ukraine back into the Stone Age. Why has that not occurred? You know, just overwhelming bombing. And second question is, from Finland down to Hungary or wherever, would there be any sense for NATO or for the Western countries to be massing troops or deploying troops for training for the purpose of distracting or creating a warning to Russia of that we are there and they have something to worry about or be concerned about, and to pull their troops away from Ukraine?
So I don't have a good answer for the Air Force question, as I think I tried to indicate during the talk. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why they're not up to that. We do know that they've taken losses when they've tried. What they've been doing instead is flying aircraft, with longer range missiles still over Russian territory, right, or over occupied territory, and launching them from there. The problem is they don't have an infinite supply of longer range missiles. So my guess is that they don't trust themselves not to take serious losses, but I don't have a good answer. The problem with bringing, like we're already at a fairly high level of West Russia tension, right? So bringing more forces to the border with Russia has a potential for unintended escalation, right? And I think that certainly the U.S. leadership has tried to steer clear of that. They do, and they have continued to do exercises, right? Telegraphing very clearly these are exercises, and they'll bring people in, they'll do the exercise, whether in the Baltics, Finland, Poland, whatever, and then they go back to wherever they're based. So that, and the Russians are doing some too, right? I mean, they're maybe smaller than they were before, but both sides just had nuclear exercises recently that were, regular nuclear exercises. And so those kinds of things are happening. Doing things that would pull Russian troops elsewhere. You have two problems. There's two options. Either the Russians don't believe you because they don't think you actually want to start a war, or they do believe you, and in that case, bad things could happen, right?
Sorry, before I give this to Professor Barnes, somebody asked me this question. What is likely to happen to the large nuclear power plant? And I would make that bigger. What on earth are the Russians doing with the large nuclear power plant, both the operating one, by Zaporizhzhia, and also that sort of old one that is sort of got messed up. Chernobyl. What on earth are the Russians doing with these nuclear plants?
Well, Chernobyl, I think is that's near Kiev. That's safe for the moment. In that they were messing around there when they were in that territory in March, but not anymore. Zaporizhzhia, I'm not sure. I'm not a nuclear energy expert. I'm not sure it's. I had thought that they had stopped generating power, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it had at some point, but maybe it had restarted and I missed it. I'm not sure. But the problem right now is not the power plant. It's they have waste stored there, and if they wanted to do a false flag, dirty bomb type thing of some kind, that could be where they could get the materials. But I don't know what they're actually doing.
All right. I did turn it on. There we go. So, yeah, I appreciated sort of everything that you showed us, and also your careful thinking through of the multiple pieces that are involved. And so if this changes, these other four things might change in this other way and so forth. If you were to simplify all that out, right, take out the U.S. Elections, take out European misgivings over the winter when they don't have gas and all that sort of just from a material and logistical sort of perspective, how long can Russia keep going? The question at the outset was sort of how long Ukraine could keep going, and they surprised certainly me and many others. Presumably Russia can't fight forever, but I feel like they could fight for a very long time. When can
they
they?
can fight for a long time?
Okay.
Right. I mean, they may continue to lose some territory, right? But they're, I mean, as, let me see if there's a map here I can get to quickly. Okay. You know, as, like right now, they still have this very long front line, right? And if you think about lines of communication, if you're Ukrainian and you want to move forces from here to here, you know, you got pretty good lines. You know, you can do that. Whereas the Russians, if they want to move forces from here to here, they have to go here. There is a rail line here. It's single track, and they can come under attack in certain places around here. So not a great option. You need to go down here, go around. Much longer, right? So if they start losing more territory, the more territory they lose, the easier it is for them to defend what's left, right? Like Crimea is hard to attack, right? Like if you just look at geographically, it's hard to attack. You can maybe starve it out if you take this territory back. You can maybe get in range to destroy the bridge for good. Blockade here. Now what do you do, right? If you're Russia, but again, you know, if they're just defending this territory, it's very close to Russian supply lines, so it's much easier to defend. So, and then they could just keep going. I mean, they've got a lot of, you know, there's a lot of belt tightening that Russians can do if they need to.
Well, you mentioned the fact that Russia may have thought this could have been 2 weeks. Mentioned the fact that not all of their soldiers were on the same page, and other examples of under preparation, and like poor planning. So is that a result of Russian arrogance and feelings of intense superiority, or are there also other forces at work to have such a bad battle plan going into this?
I think a lot of it is about superiority and sort of, you know, how can, you know, we're clearly, you know, what are these Ukrainians, right? And you know, there are, you know, little Russians, right? That was the old name. And combined with this misperception that Ukrainians, that some significant percentage of Ukrainians are going to support, you know, are actually pro-Russian, right? And if they could just get rid of the Nazi rulers in their terms, then the other, you know, half the population would come on their side. A profound misunderstanding of the changes in Ukrainian political identity since 2014, and there's actually one of my colleagues in this group that Kelly and I both and Andrew belong to, Ponars, just published an article on this recently, Vladimir Kulik, on changes in Ukrainian identity. It's worth looking at. But also, so that's the major reason. But I think a second reason is that there was in a personalist autocracy, people lower down on the ladder don't want to, you know, give the leader bad news. So they were kind of, you know, at each, and that goes down the chain, right? So people were embellishing the readiness, the capabilities of their forces prior to the invasion. They were certainly hiding the, you know, there was some, you know, corruption, theft of equipment, things like that, supplies that had been taking place for sure. And, you know, nobody's going to talk about what was going on there. So I think those kind of factors also impacted readiness.
Hey, thank you. So my question was more directed with the beginning of your presentation. You mentioned how Russia wanted to have a pro-Russia government in Ukraine, or at least a neutral one, in your words. So my question was, wouldn't it have been maybe preventable from the West to incentivize the idea of keeping Ukraine neutral or preventing Ukraine from joining NATO? Do you think that this could have been a useful outcome, or Ukraine does need to be in NATO for X or Y reason? And do you think that maybe doing it now, incentivizing the idea of Ukraine remaining neutral, will sort of help Russia withdraw from this area? And if not, what do you think could be a strategy for a peaceful solution?
So I think so first of all, before the war, right, the West had no interest of including Ukraine in NATO, right? Like that was just not, NATO membership was really not in the cards. I mean, there was, if you go back to all the way back to 2008, there was maybe a strategic mistake that was made in promising Ukraine and Georgia NATO membership in some indefinite future, which had, the West tried to do it as a kind of, you can be in NATO eventually, and we know that, this is like Turkey EU membership, right? It's like it'll happen at some point, right? But the Russians interpreted it as we have a window, right? Eventually, Ukraine and Georgia will be in NATO. But right now they're not, and they don't have security guarantees. So now is the time to act, right? So that was maybe a bad move strategically. But I don't think I think that Ukraine was not if Russia's goal was to keep Ukraine out of alliances with NATO, in some ways, what they've done, as it turned out, has been the worst possible outcome, right? Because now, again, other than for the security guarantees, in terms of military cooperation, Ukraine is closer to NATO than it ever has been. Right now, it's getting all this military assistance. There's a lot of intelligence sharing, all sorts of things. For the future, I think a neutral Ukraine is really in the current, at least in the current larger geopolitical environment, is kind of out of the question, because no one in Ukraine will ever trust Russian security guarantees, right? So now, like before, like okay, well, we'll be neutral, and everyone, that was maybe an option, but now they've been invaded. Despite the 1994, there was a promise that in exchange for giving up nuclear weapons, that Ukraine, Russia, and everyone else would respect Ukrainian sovereignty and so forth. Obviously, Russia didn't do that. So why would they? Why trust? I mean, from the Ukrainian perspective, any ceasefire is just an opportunity for Russia to kind of rearm and go again, and so from that perspective, and that perspective has validity to some extent, right? With the current regime, I don't think that Russia's ready to give up on its plans for Ukraine just because it's failing at the moment. So I'm not very optimistic of that. Something like neutrality would solve anything, because there's also the other part. Which is the control over Ukrainian, the Russian leadership wants to have control over Ukraine. Doesn't necessarily mean they want to annex Ukraine, but they want to have, although obviously they have parts now, but they do want to have say, in who runs Ukraine, and make sure it's not somebody who's anti-Russian, which I think is at this point impossible except through some kind of puppet state.
Popular perception amongst people who at least know a little bit about international relations is that the Russians and the Chinese are somewhat united in the one aspect that they're opposed to American hegemony and Western-backed international order. However, the Chinese response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been muted, and it's not necessarily indicative of that full-scale support that one might expect. But with Western sanctions on Russia wreaking havoc on its economy, do you foresee that the Russo-Chinese relationship, despite maybe the muted response on China's part and the conflicting strategic interests in Central Asia, do you foresee Russia going further and further into the arms of Xi Jinping in that sense to replace or at least gain new markets that they lost from Western sanctions?
So I think the Russians don't have many options. So I think they would do this. The problem for them right now is that the Chinese are not all that, as you just suggested, are not all that ready to embrace the Russians because they have these other interests, including the economic interests with Europe and the U.S. that mean that they're being very cautious. So they're not officially, I mean, I'm sure there are some, underground routes for supplying banned, sanctioned goods to Russia, but they're not doing it openly for sure. And I think the government would, counsel the Chinese, the big companies are certainly not doing it. So, and we saw, very lukewarm support in the last, the summit in Central Asia recently. So I think that China's going to continue. My sense is that the Chinese leadership kind of sees Russia as a little bit of a loose cannon now. And so, they're willing to, the Chinese relationship vis-a-vis Russia has always been, we're happy, we're happy to take their energy, arms, whatever, but we're not going to make any, we're going to drive a hard bargain and we're going to make sure it's to our advantage. And so I think that's can continue, and they're not going to do anything that might jeopardize broader equities.
It has always seemed to me that there was a fundamental asymmetry here, which is that the Russians, if they chose, could wreak civilian havoc on Ukraine. And the Ukrainians, at least if the West had anything to do with it, would not do something similar to the Russians. And, and winter's going to be pretty bad for both sides. Nevertheless, it would presumably be much worse for Ukraine than it would be for Russia. So that raises two questions. Given this fundamental asymmetry in the ability to wage war against the civilian population of the other country, how in the long run does that play out for Ukraine? If the Russians are willing to do that, how does, and the second aspect of that is, given that situation, how long can the Ukrainians go before they say, screw it, West, we're sending some of those missiles over the border? And we're hitting some of the Russian power plants. We're hitting some of,
they've been doing it to a little bit already, right? It's not like they're just not using Western weapons to do that, right? But Belgrade's been hit. They've had powder outages in Belgrade once in a while. I think that, this asymmetry is why, it's kind of answer to Andrew's question. I thought that they could continue the Russians for a long time, because they can basically make okay, we're going to keep maybe taking territorial losses, on territory that we've occupied from you, but we're going to make it so you can't have a normal life as long as this war goes on, with the goal of eventually forcing you to the negotiating table where we will cement some gains. I think that, and that's why I think that, at some point, and it's an open question of when, but at some point there's a new line that's stabilized, that is at, somewhere probably farther than, Ukraine controls more territory than it does today, but Russia controls more territory than it did on February 23rd, right? And then we get to, what was that, scenario 2 or whatever it was, the kind of the stalemate and pressure, and then there's pressure for a ceasefire that doesn't come just from the West, but there's also, if you're not making gains, at some point there may well be a Ukrainian internal lobby that says, let's try to get back to some level of, if we're not making progress, let's at least try to freeze the conflict so we can kind of rebuild our country.
Is there any situation that you can imagine in which the Russian military, we talked about damage to civilians, but in which the Russian military is experiencing so much pain, in terms of its troops getting killed and so on, that the Russian military wants out?
I mean, sure, it's possible. This whole mobilization thing may turn out to be, useless. They take more losses. You could see, scenario where there's, they're losing territory. They're losing a lot of this territory, right? And they sort of feel like maybe we need to make some changes. But I think it'll take a lot, right? Because it is a very top-down system.
I can think of many, many other questions that other people can. I've learned a lot. One of the things that most struck me actually was at the beginning with the talk about the Russian war goals, which potentially lead to some possible negotiations at the end. Although again, I don't see how the Ukrainians would ever believe that they became limited. But I'd like to thank you so much for coming. And I'd like to thank the audience for coming. And if anybody's out there in virtual land, I think there probably are some people. I want to thank you for watching. Anybody who wants, this has been live streamed, and so there will be a recording. I guess anybody who wants to know where to find that recording, again, email me, and we will actually post the recording on the website of the Center for Policy Studies, which is policy.case.edu, within a few days. Thank you very much for Professor Barnes from Kent State, Professor McMahon from Case Western, and all of you, and particularly Dr. Gorenburg. Thanks for having me.